Please don't hurt me. I'm already hurt. The plea cut through the night like a knife. Rio Grande, New Mexico Territory. Autumn, 1872. The moon hung low, laying a pale path across the slow, curling river. Wind slid through the reeds, making them whisper. Frogs chirped. Crickets hummed. Then a voice broke the quiet, and every small sound seemed to vanish. Please don't beat me. I'm already hurt. Horses snorted somewhere in the brush. A young woman stumbled onto the muddy bank, yanked forward by her wrist. She could not be older than 20. She was thin, shaking, and barefoot, her feet striped with dirt and blood. Torn cloth clung to her shoulders. Her hair was a tangled curtain hiding half her bruised face. Tears made trails through the grime. Abigail Harper gasped and tried to pull free. The man dragging her growled, "I said walk," and raised his hand to strike. Click. The crisp sound of a rifle cocking cracked the dark like thunder. Both of them froze. Across the river, under a warped cottonwood, a figure stood still as stone. The man was tall. He blended with the shadow until starlight touched the metal of the rifle and the brim of a weathered hat. His face stayed dark beneath it. His mouth kept shut. No warning. No name. Just the rifle leveled and ready. The man gripping Abigail squinted into the dim. He hesitated, shifting from one boot to the other. The stillness from the stranger seemed to press on him, heavy as a boulder. He let go of her wrist. "I didn't mean trouble," he mumbled, shuffling backward. When the stranger didn't move, he cursed under his breath and slipped into the brush like a rattler scared from a campfire. The river took back its quiet. Abigail fell to her knees, pain spiking in her ribs. She coughed and threw one arm over her face, peering up through her hair. Who are you?" The figure still said nothing. He stepped into the shallow water. His boots splashed softly as he crossed. When he reached her, she flinched. He didn't loom. He knelt. His eyes were deep-set and unreadable. They weren't cruel. He slid his arms under her and lifted her as if he'd done it 100 times. She tensed at the touch, but she didn't fight. For the first time in days, no hand hit her. No angry voice snapped orders. His grip was careful, not soft, but sure. Practiced. Like he had carried hurt people before. He walked away from the river, his boot prints pressing neat ovals in the damp earth. They moved beyond the tall grass, through a fringe of thin woods. A small cabin showed itself between the trunks, a single window winking orange light from a low lamp. Abigail drifted in and out, every jolt sending shock through her sore side. But the steadiness of his steps, the smell of leather and pine on his coat, and the calm rhythm of his breathing tugged her back to the world. At the door, he nudged it open with his boot. The room was plain, a rough table, one bed, shelves lined with jars and dried stems. A small fire ticked in the stone hearth. He set her on the bed like she might break. Then he stepped away. She watched him pour water into a basin. He ripped a clean cloth, no hesitation, and came back to her. Only then did she hear his voice. "You're safe now." It sounded rough and low, like a voice that hadn't been used in a long time. She blinked. "Why did you help me?" He didn't answer at once. He wet the cloth and pressed it to her temple, steady and gentle. When he finally spoke again, the words were simple but firm. Nobody should be hurt like that. He turned and stirred the fire. Abigail lay still, shaking but warming. The room smelled like cedar smoke and herbs. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what sunrise might bring. But tonight she wasn't alone on a riverbank. Tonight, someone had stood between her and pain, and he hadn't needed to say a thing to do it. When Abigail opened her eyes, the cabin was quiet. Dark beams crossed the low ceiling. The fire snapped softly, casting a dance of light across the walls. The air carried. Smoke pine resin, and something sharper, crushed leaves, maybe. Her body ached in layers. Every breath pressed against the bruises on her ribs. She turned her head and saw him. The man sat nearby, sleeves rolled, hands working with neat care. He was cleaning a cut on her arm she hadn't noticed. His movements were quick and practiced, never lingering, never rough. On the table lay strips of cloth, a small mortar of crushed herbs, and a tin of salve. He looked up when he felt her watching. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Safe," he said. The voice was the same, gravelly, low, short on words. She studied him by firelight. He was older than she had guessed at first, maybe 30. Faint lines marked his brow. A few days, stubble darkened his jaw. But his eyes, gray-blue and steady, held something that made her feel seen and hidden at the same time. "Who are you?" she asked again. "Caleb." That was all. He dipped the cloth and went back to work. Abigail turned toward the wall and fell quiet. The next morning, she tried to sit up without help. Caleb watched from across the room, but he didn't rush over. He waited. When she winced and slumped back with a groan, he brought water and set it within reach. By evening, she stood for the first time. Days slipped by. Mornings came with thin sunlight and bird song from the river. In the afternoons, Caleb split wood, fished along the bank, or bent over neat rows in a small garden out back. He spoke only when useful, and even then his answers were short. Abigail filled the silence. Words felt like steps, wobbly at first, then steadier. She told him about the mine owner her father had promised her to. About the first time the man hit her for speaking out of turn. About bruises that never got the chance to fade. About begging her father not to send her back and seeing nothing change in his eyes. "I was a debt," she said one morning, cupping weak tea on the porch. A body to trade. That's all he ever saw. Caleb whittled something with a small knife on the steps. He didn't look up. He didn't answer. But the next morning, a fresh loaf wrapped in cloth waited by her pillow. He never asked questions. Not about where she came from. Not about why she cried in her sleep. He left a stack of old clothes folded on the stool, women's dresses, a shawl with a tidy stitched edge, and boots too large but dry and warm. He did not mention them. Abigail began to do small things. She swept the porch. She cleaned wild herbs and sorted them by smell and shape. She tried to fix a broken shutter, fumbling the hammer. Caleb handed her nails and stepped back. Each night she returned to her small cot and found it straightened, the pillow fluffed. She never saw him do it. She didn't need to. One night, while the fire burned low, she said, "You don't talk much." He didn't lift his eyes. Words are cheap. She frowned. And silence sometimes costs more. That was the longest line he'd spoken since the river. She didn't know exactly when the fear faded. She didn't know which night she'd stopped flinching at footsteps, or which morning she'd stopped checking the window for shadows. One day, brushing her hair in the doorway, with sunlight on her shoulders, it hit her. She had slept through the night without fear. Caleb passed with a bucket of water. Their eyes met for a breath. She smiled, not forced, not polite, real. He didn't smile back, but he gave a short nod and walked on into the trees. While sweeping near a small shelf, Abigail noticed a worn, leather-bound notebook wedged between two dented tins and a bundle of dried sage. She hesitated, then pulled it free. The edges curled with age. The pages had yellowed, the ink faded in places. Sketches filled one spread, neat drawings of the human body with X marks and tiny notes in tight handwriting. Names lined the margins: Private Mitchell, Sergeant Holloway. Dates, dosages, battlefield weather. A drawing, rough but tender, showed a woman wearing a nurse's cap, smiling with eyes bright and alive. The door opened behind her. Caleb stepped in with an armful of kindling. He paused, then set it down calmly. "That's not for the fire," he said. "I wasn't going to burn it," Abigail replied softly. "Is it yours?" He nodded once. "You were a doctor," she said without thinking. "Army medic," he corrected. "During the war?" She didn't push. After a minute, he sat on the bench and stared at the flames. When he spoke, the words were a whisper that seemed to take effort. 15 minutes late. She frowned. He kept going, steady but quiet. "My platoon 40 men. I was the only one with field training. We got held up at the canyon pass. They were ambushed before I reached them." She stayed silent. His hands pressed into his thighs until the knuckles whitened. "I spent the night dragging bodies into a ditch," he said. "I couldn't save one. Not even her." "Her?" Abigail asked. He stared into the fire. "My wife, Nora. She was a field nurse. Volunteered because I did. We were assigned together, mostly. That day, they sent us apart. I told her I'd meet her after I helped the cavalry. I was late." The room felt heavy, like dust settling after a long ride. "I held her while she bled out," he said at last. She apologized. "Can you believe that?" Said, "Sorry for dying." Abigail's throat burned. He went on. "I left the army. Couldn't look at another wound without seeing her. I followed the river because she loved it. We planned to live near water after the war." He looked at the floor. "Instead, I buried her by it." Abigail closed the notebook and set it near the hearth. Her fingers ached to touch his hand, but she didn't. Not yet. Not that day. At dawn, she rose early and coaxed the fire to life. She found an onion, a pinch of dried peppers, and the last of the salted meat. He had once said Nora made stew that bit back. Abigail tried. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm and had some heat. At supper, she set the bowl in front of him. He took one taste, blinked, and nodded just a twitch. Later, while he mended fence, she folded his blanket for the first time, corners smooth, edges tucked. She didn't ask him anything that night. But when he came in and their eyes met, something new stood between them. Thin as a thread, strong as rope. Two worn souls, each cracked at the edges, shared the same room. Not fixed, not whole, but no longer alone. The sun turned the river gold in the late evening, light filtering through the trees that hugged the bank. The world grew softer at that hour. The chirp of crickets, the hush of water, the low pop of firewood in the hearth. Inside the patched cabin, Abigail moved with a calm she hadn't felt in years. She set a small wild daisy at the center of the table. Just a flower. No speech. No meaning forced onto it. Caleb noticed. He always did. He didn't say anything that evening. He stirred the pot and kept his eyes on the flame. The next afternoon, when Abigail came home with a handful of berries, she noticed the daisy tucked into a little glass jar she remembered gathering dust above his desk. Now it sat beside his notes and pencils, as if it had always belonged. He said nothing. So did she. A few days later, Abigail found one of his shirts torn at the elbow while she folded clothes. The stitching had frayed. She threaded a needle, without thinking, and set to work. The result wasn't perfect, but the seam held. She left the shirt folded at the foot of his bed. In the morning, the shirt was gone. When he stepped out to split wood, he was wearing it. Their eyes met in passing. No exchange of words. Warmth filled the space anyway, like coals that never quite go out. On a quiet evening, she returned from the river to find a book on her side of the table. The cover was cracked with age. The title was about field medicine. Notes crowded the margins in faded ink. She lifted it and glanced at him, where he sat polishing a knife. "Is this a hint," she asked, "or a gift?" He looked over the rim of his cup. "Both." She laughed under her breath. "Then I'd better learn your bitter tea." "You already do," he murmured, the corner of his mouth turning up a fraction. After that, Caleb spoke more. Not in long stories, but in lines that felt like bridges. One sentence here, a dry joke there. A glance across the stew pot that became a quick, shared smile. Abigail learned he hated burnt biscuits, always slept with the window cracked, and double-knotted the twine around his herb bundles. She noticed how he paused when she hummed while sweeping. Sometimes he stopped in the doorway, not to watch her, just to be close. Once, she oversalted the stew. She took a bite, made a face, and muttered, "I ruined dinner." Caleb ate another spoonful. "Tastes like survival," he said, and to her surprise, he smiled, small, true. That night, Abigail folded a blanket near the hearth and caught herself watching him sharpen a blade. Firelight picked out the lines of his face. His hands moved smooth and sure. Duty had shaped him. Grief had carved him. Yet here he was, sharing quiet meals, and a daisy jar with the same girl he had pulled from the mud. She turned away before he saw her looking. He had noticed anyway, just as she noticed the extra log he threw on the fire when the chill crept in, or how he stirred soup counterclockwise, the way her mother used to. Somewhere between silence and stitches, between a daisy and a book, the gap between them thinned. No grand speeches. No big promises. Only the steady rhythm of two people learning to trust life again. Under a sky scattered with stars, the fire crackled easy. For the first time, Caleb left the cabin door open at night. The stillness broke on a different night. Crickets stopped their song. The river hushed in a strange, heavy way. Abigail stirred on her cot, blinking at a weird flicker beyond the window. At first, she thought it was moonlight. Then the smell reached her, sharp and choking. Smoke. She sat up, coughing. "Caleb." No reply. She threw the door wide. Orange-red light flashed across the clearing. Flames climbed the side of the cabin, hungry tongues licking along the logs. Smoke rolled above the trees in thick, black waves. Shouts ripped through the brush. Jeering voices. "She's hiding here. Torch it. Let's see if she runs." Abigail froze on the grass, bare feet cold against the ground. Twigs snapped. Heavy boots pounded closer. A hand grabbed her wrist. "Run." Caleb's face was streaked with soot. His jaw set like iron. His eyes cut across the tree line, already measuring paths and cover. He had a bough slung over his back and a knife in his hand. "The cabin, your things," she started. "I can build again," he said. "I can't build you." He didn't wait for argument. He pulled her into motion, and they darted between the trees. Roots snagged their toes. Branches raked their arms. Behind them, the fire roared louder. Worse than the flames were the footsteps. 5 men, maybe more. "Where are we going?" Abigail gasped. "The creek," Caleb said between breaths. "There's a cave. They won't find it in the dark." They splashed into the icy water. Stones shifted underfoot. Abigail slipped and nearly went under, but Caleb never let go of her. Always her wrist. Always steady. If he released her, it felt like she might vanish. Gunfire cracked behind them. Water leaped beside them. Bullets slapping into the current. Abigail screamed. "Keep going." Caleb barked. Another shot tore the air. Caleb stumbled. His grip faltered for a heartbeat. "Caleb." He clenched his teeth and kept moving. "It's nothing." She saw the blood spreading across the back of his shirt, dark and swift, like ink blooming in a pool. He never cried out. He didn't slow. They reached the far bank. He pushed her up first, then hauled himself after, breath ragged. "Close," he managed. They climbed a narrow ridge, more like a goat path than a trail, and squeezed into the mouth of a low rock overhang hidden by brush. Blackness swallowed them. The only sounds were their breathing and the far-off rage of fire devouring the place they had shared. Abigail lit a small lantern. Its flames shivered and showed him clearly for the first time. Shirt torn, skin slick with blood and river water, sweat standing on his brow. His hand pressed hard against his back. "Let me see," she said, her voice trembling. "Just a scratch," he answered, waving her away. "Caleb," she said again, firmer. He closed his eyes. When he spoke, it was gentle. "We're safe. That's enough." But she knew it wasn't. He had bled for her. He had run for her. He had risked everything without asking for thanks. She reached for the satchel he had thrown over her shoulder before they fled, the same bag she had kept near her cot. Herbs. Cloth. The book he had given her. She set to work. He leaned against cool stone and went quiet while she cleaned the cut. He didn't even flinch. The cave smelled like wet rock and iron. As she worked, his breath slowed. Her hands shook, but they didn't stop. "They wanted to burn me out," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "They wanted to drag me back." "They won't," he said. "You could have let them." "I never thought about it." His eyes found hers in the low light. There in the dark, chest rising uneven, blood drying on his shirt. He gave her something she had never been offered before, certainty. He would take the wound before he let them take her. He already had. She would carry that truth forever. The cave quieted to the soft rasp of Caleb's breathing. Abigail held the lantern low and knelt beside him. His face had gone pale. Sweat shone across his temple. When she touched his forehead, heat burned through her fingers. Fever. She dug through the satchel, herbs, a water skin, the dog-eared notebook he'd once put in her hands with no explanation. She had read it at night by the fire, page by page, while he carved, while he sharpened steel. Now those notes might be the thin line between getting better and getting worse. The wound was deeper than she thought. The bleeding had slowed, but angry heat had crept in. Red blotches stained his skin. "Caleb," she whispered, brushing damp hair from his brow. "Stay with me. Please." His lips moved. "Rachel." The name struck her still. Not hers. "Rachel," he breathed again, a broken apology. "I'm sorry I was late." Abigail swallowed hard. She knew the name. He had spoken it once by the fire, his wife. The reason he had stepped off the world and settled by a river that would not judge him. She held his hand. "I'm not her," she whispered. "I know that. I don't want to replace her." Her voice shook, but she did not let go. "I only want to stay, if you'll let me." He drifted into fevered sleep. Abigail stood with a new kind of purpose. She slipped to the cave's edge and searched the night for the plants she had seen in the book. Willow bark for the pain, mint for cool cloths, cattail fluff for padding. Her mother had once taught her the woods, how to boil leaves and scrape bark. The old lessons rose up in her fingers like they'd just been waiting. She lit a small fire near the opening and set water to heat in a dented tin. With a dull knife, she scraped the bitter inside of a willow branch, hands shaking as she measured. She reread each step 3 times before doing anything. She brewed the bark to tea and fed it to him in small sips. She folded cloth, dipped it in mint water, and laid it across his chest. When he shivered, she slid beside him, letting his head rest against her shoulder. She whispered soft nonsense and bits of lullabies she barely remembered. Morning found her sitting upright, back to stone, fingers still laced with his. The lantern had burned out. His eyes were open now, clear, focused. "Hey," she breathed. "You stayed," he rasped. She nodded, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. He looked down at their hands. "You did it." She gave a shaky laugh. "No," she said. "We did." She checked the dressing. He didn't flinch. He was stronger. Not well yet, but better. Her work mattered. She mattered. The girl who once begged for someone to save her had held another person through the dark and brought him to the light of day. Outside, the fire at the cave mouth had thinned to embers. Dawn brushed pale pink across the sky. Abigail leaned against the stone and watched morning unwind. She had faced blood. She had faced fear. She had faced the memory of a woman she could never be. And still, she had not left. Not because Caleb needed her, but because she chose to stay. The river moved like a silver ribbon beneath the soft sky. Mist drifted above the water like a breath not fully released. Caleb sat on a flat rock near the bank, hat at his side, arms looped over his knees. His shoulder ached under Abigail's neat bandage, but each breath arrived easier than the last. Abigail stepped from the trees, carrying a tin cup. She wore the oversized coat. He'd given her sleeves rolled and frayed. She sat beside him and passed the cup without speaking. He took it with a nod. They listened to the water. A bird chirped far off. Steam curled around her face as she sipped. Caleb watched the current slide past the rocks. "Why didn't you run when you could?" he asked, voice low and even. She blinked. He didn't look at her. He stared at the water, as if the answer might be written there. She set her cup on the moss and hugged her knees. "Because for the first time," she said slowly, "someone saw me as a person worth keeping, not a burden to pass along." His jaw tightened for a second. He turned to her. "Really, I'm not brave," she went on. "I ran from pain, from a cage built by someone else. But here, you didn't try to fix me. You let me be." "You deserved that," he murmured. She smiled, small and sure. "So did you." A breeze lifted her hair. She turned toward him, not asking, not expecting, just being. He reached for her hand like it was something precious. Their fingers slid together without force. They didn't kiss. No vows. Her head rested on his shoulder. His breath slowed. Gold sunlight crept higher over the water. In that quiet, there were no ghosts, only a girl who lived and a man who had stopped running. A soul found and another choosing to remain. For that moment, it was enough. The clearing by the river no longer smelled of smoke and ruin. The fire that had once devoured everything had left behind more than ashes. It had cleared the ground for something new. Where scorched earth once stretched black and lifeless, now soft green shoots pressed through, stubborn and alive. The quiet hum of the forest had returned, gentle wind brushing through leaves, the faint song of crickets, and the steady rhythm of the river that had witnessed it all. Caleb stood barefoot on the bank, sleeves rolled, hammer in hand. The air carried sawdust, sap, and sunlight. The foundation of a new cabin was taking shape, smaller than the first, but each beam was placed with intention. Every strike of his hammer echoed not only through the valley, but also through the silence that used to live inside him. He no longer built to survive, he built to stay. Abigail worked beside him, her skirts tied at the knees, hands streaked with mud and splinters. She gathered reeds and saplings, weaving them into the roof the way her mother had shown her in another life, a memory she thought she had lost. Caleb didn't direct her. He didn't need to. Their movements fell into rhythm, steady and wordless, like a song only they could hear. When she reached for nails, his fingers brushed hers. Neither spoke, but both felt the spark, not fire, not passion, but recognition. Two people, once broken, finding purpose in the same rhythm. They built without hurry. The new cabin grew slower, steadier, beam by beam. Sometimes Caleb paused, standing still in the golden light filtering through the trees. He would glance toward the river, where the reflection of the sky met the faint memory of everything they had lost, and breathe in deeply before continuing. By dusk, they stopped to rest. The unfinished frame cast long shadows over the clearing. Abigail leaned against a stump, her hair damp with sweat, her hands calloused from labor. Caleb handed her a tin cup of water, the same one she'd offered him that morning. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither one needed to look away. The new cabin was humbler than the one before, one room, one window, and a roof made from layers of woven reeds and pine branches. But it felt different. It felt theirs. When they stepped inside, The floor still smelled of fresh-cut wood. The fire crackled softly in a small hearth they had built from stones gathered by the river. Abigail set a bundle of dried, white daisies on the windowsill. She had picked them that morning, near the same patch of ground where they had first spoken months ago. Their petals were pale, some edges curled, but they were alive. Next to them, she laid a piece of lace she had stitched by hand, crooked, uneven, but clean. She had made it from Caleb's old torn shirts. Each thread told a story, one of pain unraveled and rewoven into something worth keeping. In the corner stood an old wooden chest. Caleb had sanded and polished it until it gleamed faintly in the firelight. On top rested his medical kit, aged leather, faded but proud. He hadn't opened it since that night in the cave. For a long time, it had been nothing but a symbol of regret, the ghost of what he couldn't save. Now, standing before it, he hesitated. His fingers brushed the strap. The late afternoon sun slid through the cracks in the wall and landed across the box, making the brass buckles glow faintly. He took a slow breath and unclasped it. Inside, the old tools waited, scalpels dulled by time, rolls of yellow gauze, a notebook filled with sketches of wounds and half-faded names. For years, he couldn't bear to look at them. They reminded him of Nora's last day, of the war, of loss. But now they looked different, like reminders not of death, but of healing. "Maybe it's time," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Maybe it's time to try again." Abigail had been mending a blanket near the fire. She looked up. "Try again." He nodded once. To help. To use what's left. She stood beside him and placed her hand on his. Her fingers were warm against the cool leather. "Then we'll do it together," she said. That evening, they stood once more at the edge of the Rio Grande. The river moved slow and steady, carrying the reflection of the moon across its glassy surface. The night air smelled of pine and smoke, but softer now, like peace had finally found its way back to the water. Abigail leaned against Caleb, his arm resting gently around her waist. They didn't speak for a long time. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, mirrored in the ripples below. "The river carried me to you," she whispered, "and I'll never drift away." Caleb didn't reply. His silence said everything. It always had. They stood that way for a long while, two shadows against the river, bound not by promises or vows, but by choice. The river murmured beside them, endless and calm, a witness to everything they had been and everything they still could become. The weeks that followed moved slower, easier. Abigail learned to wake with the sound of birds rather than nightmares. She learned the rhythm of chopping wood, the weight of silence that wasn't lonely, and the comfort of laughter that came without guilt. Caleb fixed what the fire had taken. He carved new chairs, built shelves, and planted herbs by the window. The sound of his hammer became part of her mornings, the scent of stew part of his evenings. One afternoon, a shadow passed over the cabin, riders crossing the far ridge. They paused, just long enough for Caleb's hand to reach for his rifle. But then they moved on. Abigail stood beside him, unafraid. The ghosts that had chased her were gone. That night, they shared dinner by the fire. Abigail hummed softly, a tune she couldn't quite remember the words to. Caleb listened. When she stopped, he said quietly, "You should keep singing." She smiled faintly. "I don't know the words." "Then make new ones." And she did. She sang about rivers that healed instead of drowned, about fire that cleansed instead of destroyed, and about hands that built instead of broke. Caleb didn't join in, but when the song ended, his eyes shone like the reflection of a hearth. Months passed. The seasons shifted. The trees along the Rio Grande turned gold, then bare, then green again. One morning, Abigail stepped outside to find Caleb kneeling near the garden. A young boy stood in front of him, a stranger, dusty and trembling, his clothes torn, a deep cut on his arm. Caleb's old medical kit lay open beside them. "Hold still," Caleb said gently. His voice had changed. It carried warmth now, not distance. Abigail watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with something she hadn't named before. This was who he was, who he had always been. The silent man who had once carried her from the river now carried others back to life. When the boy left that evening, bandaged and fed, Abigail found Caleb sitting on the steps, watching the water again. She came beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "You did good," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "You helped." They sat quietly, the kind of quiet that needed no words. The sun slipped lower, the air cool and clean. The years ahead weren't perfect. The land was harsh. Storms came. Crops failed some seasons. Caleb's shoulder ached when the rain fell. But through it all, they stayed. Abigail kept her daisy jar full, replacing old blooms with new ones each spring. Caleb added more notes to his old notebook, names not of soldiers this time, but of townsfolk, wanderers, and travelers he'd helped along the way. And every so often, when the nights turned cold and the fire burned low, he'd glance at Abigail, her face lit by the glow, her hands resting still, and he'd think of the river, of the night he found her, broken and scared, and the quiet choice they both made to live again. One evening, she caught him looking. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking how far we've come." "Far enough." He reached for her hand. "No, not yet." And in the golden light of their rebuilt cabin, the river whispering nearby, they stayed. Two souls who had learned that love wasn't loud or sudden, but quiet, built plank by plank, stitch by stitch, over time. Because sometimes the truest love stories don't start with a kiss or end with a promise. They start with a simple act of mercy and grow into something worth living for.